Is the 66th anniversary of the U.S. atomic bombing of Nagasaki, which killed some 75,000 people and left another 75,000 seriously wounded. It came just 3 days after the U.S. dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, killing around 80,000 people, injuring some 70,000. By official Japanese estimates, nearly 300,000 people died from the bombings, including those who lost their lives in the ensuing months and years from related injuries and illnesses. Other researchers estimate a much higher death toll. The atomic bombings of Japan remain the only time nuclear weapons have been used in war to date. The story of the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist George Weller. Weller was the first reporter to enter Nagasaki, defying a U.S. media ban in southern Japan. He worked for the Chicago Daily News, hired a rowboat to get himself to Nagasaki. He wrote a 25,000-word report on the horrors he encountered. When he submitted his story to the military censors, General Douglas MacArthur personally ordered the story killed, and the manuscript was never returned. George Weller later summarized his experience with the government censors, saying, "They won." Well, years ago, George Weller's son, Anthony, discovered a copy of the suppressed dispatches among his late father's papers. George Weller died in 2002. They're now published as a book called First into Nagasaki, the censored eyewitness dispatches on post-atomic Japan and its prisoners of war. This is an excerpt of an interview that Juan Gonzalez and I did with Anthony Weller, George Weller's son, shortly after he first discovered his late father's papers.
Well, I think the thing that astonished him the most, I mean, there were many things that he found astonishing. Remember, he went in there 4 weeks almost to the minute after the bomb was dropped, which was on the 6th of September in mid-morning is when he arrived. And he was struck, obviously, by several things, by the physical appearance of the city, which was still smoldering here and there, by the surgical precision of the bomb itself. Later, he was to learn that, in fact, a great deal of damage had been done, not just by the bomb, but by the fires that erupted, because people were cooking their midday meal when the bomb hit, and a number of wooden residences just caught fire, and the fire spread. So, in a way, it was kind of like a Dresden. And as he went round the ruins of the city and rapidly began visiting all the hospital facilities that still existed, I know he was struck immediately first by the absence of any American medical personnel. 4 weeks later, there were still no doctors or nurses. And then by the great precision and care with which the Japanese doctors had already cataloged the effects of the bomb on individual organs of the body. And over the next few days, he was as astonished as the Japanese doctors were, of course, by what he referred to in his reports as disease X. It was perhaps not so astonishing to see some of the scorches and burns that people had suffered, but to see people apparently unblemished at all by the bomb, who had seemingly survived intact, suddenly finding themselves feeling unwell and going to hospital, sitting there on their cots surrounded by doctors and relatives who could do nothing, and finding when he would go back the next day that they had just died. Or that, let's say, a woman who had come through unscathed, making dinner for her husband and having the misfortune to make a very small cut in her finger while peeling a lemon, would just keep bleeding and bleed to death because the platelets in her bloodstream had been so reduced that the blood couldn't clot anymore. So there were case after case like this, and in a way, I think my father found them more poignant than the obvious destruction or the obvious burn victims, because here was a whole team of Japanese doctors, very able, very aware from long before the war had started about the potentials of radiation, absolutely baffled And he had a wonderful phrase he used. He said the effects of the bomb, uncured because the effects of disease X, which is what they were calling it, uncured because it is untreated, and untreated because it is undiagnosed.
Anthony Weller, the son of George Weller, whose story on the Nagasaki bombings was blocked by military censors. As we turn now to an account of the 1945 atomic bombing of Nagasaki by the pilots who flew the B-29 bomber that dropped that bomb. This is an excerpt of the documentary Hiroshima Countdown, produced by Andrew Phillips.
This is one in a series of interviews conducted by the Air Force Historical Division. Today we are interviewing Brigadier General Paul W. Tibbets, Jr., who is retiring.
They were definitely military targets. There was no question about that. And they offered such a, well, you could almost say a classroom experiment as far as being able to determine later the bomb damage. These were good virgin targets, and they were ideal for the purpose that we wanted to use them for.
The consideration of targets would be Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Niigata, Kokura, and there was one more that I don't remember. The 20th Air Force had been told they would not attack those targets under any circumstances. In other words, the ground was laid.
As well as these targets, Kyoto, Japan's ancient capital, was strongly recommended by the man with overall control of the bomb project, General Leslie Groves. But Secretary of War Henry Stimson, approaching 80 years of age, would not have it. He'd visited Kyoto with his wife in the 20s and had enjoyed the city's cultural riches. It was a city of great religious significance to the Japanese, and Stimson felt Kyoto's destruction would damage America's post-war stature.
The selection of the targets in the month of May, 1945, was actually done by the intelligence community in headquarters U.S. Air Force. The requirements given to them was, you will select cities that have military targets in them. And they also selected the type of terrain that they wanted. They also were interested in the type of construction that they could expect to run into. Because in reality, not only was this a military mission, but it was also of extreme scientific importance, because they wanted to know what a weapon of this type could do against reinforced concrete, what it could do against steel, what it would do against anything that was in the building materials line. It had to be something that had not been attacked by the 20th Air Force up to that time. Call it virgin targets, undamaged, unhurt by any other type of an explosive or munition.
I knew the type of bomb we were working on.
Charles Sweeney flew with Tibbets in an observer aircraft to witness the bombing of Hiroshima. 3 days later, he would lead his crew first to Kokura, the primary target for the second bomb, and then to Nagasaki. Kokura was clouded in that day.
As he was talking, he picked up a handful of earth. He said, basically what we're working on is a single bomb that will turn a whole city into this. And he just tossed a handful of sand into the air.
The voices of the men who loaded and flew the B-29 bomber that dropped the atomic bomb on Nagasaki, August 9, 1945. From the documentary Hiroshima Countdown, produced by Andrew Phillips. We'll link to the whole documentary at democracynow.org. Our guest is Greg Mitchell. He writes the Media Fix blog for TheNation.com. He's author of numerous books. His latest is Atomic Cover-Up, 2 U.S. soldiers, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the greatest movie never made. Welcome. You have been covering this for decades. The significance, Greg, of this day, August 9th, 66 years ago, and what it means today in nuclear-ravaged Japan.
Right. Well, of course, it's particularly poignant given the Fukushima nuclear disaster, and the similarly to after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the fears of so many people that they've been tainted by released radiation, and so the psychological effects of the nuclear disaster are severe. And in fact, survivors of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki have been campaigning this year against nuclear power, which is something they haven't particularly done in the past, linking nuclear weapons and nuclear power, the fear of radiation, the chance of catastrophe, the chance of disaster. So it's a special day for that. And of course, the other reason is because, as I've pointed out for many years, the U.S. is the only country that has used the bomb twice in war, as you mentioned. And, you know, it may surprise many people to know we still have a first-use policy in the United States. And the lesson that has been handed down to us for decades now is that, yes, never again, we should never use nuclear weapons again. However, we continue, most Americans, certainly American leaders, American policymakers, American media, all defend the use of the bomb, or the double use of the bomb, back in 1945. So the message is these weapons are too dangerous to use, but we used them before, we continue to defend it, we continue to have a first strike policy. So to me, that's a very dangerous lesson of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Talk about the color videotape of the atomic bombing that has rarely been shown, and yet it's been around, well, since right after the bombing.
Right. Well, that's basically what my new book is about. It's about the suppression of this footage, both the American footage, which was in color and was shot by the U.S. military, and the Japanese footage, which is shot by the Japanese newsreel team and is in black and white. In fact, in your first part of this program, almost all the images that people saw on the screen was black and white footage. Even to this day, not many people have seen much of the color footage, and that's because the U.S. suppressed that color footage shot by our own military for decades. And it really wasn't until the 1980s that any of it came out. Snippets have been used in film, you know, so we see a little bit more of it now. But in this key moment in our nuclear history, as nuclear power was becoming entrenched, as nuclear arms race continued for decades, Americans were not exposed to the full truth of the bomb.
Interestingly, the scientists at Los Alamos who made the bomb, most of them thinking that it would be used, if need be, on Germany, actually were privately shown this video, weren't they? Yeah,
and so the video was taken by the Pentagon, and parts of it were made into training films to show, you know, show our policymakers and our military what the bomb could do. What my book focuses on is 2 U.S. military officers who shot the footage and then for decades after tried to get it released, tried to get it shown on TV, tried to get it made into a movie to be shown in theaters. Daniel McGovern and Herbert Susan. And they tried for decades to get it released and shown to a wider public, and it really didn't happen until, you know, just a few years ago.
Talk about the YouTube video that you just didn't think was particularly controversial. It was a kind of promo for your book, illustrating your point.
Yeah, well, if people search for it on YouTube under Atomic Cover-Up, they'll find it. It's just a 2-minute video, and it includes some of the suppressed footage. And I think that's why, after I loaded it on YouTube, I got a notice from Google that they were not going to allow any ads for it because it showed, because of the promoted violence, as they said, which was, of course, 180 degrees from what it really did. It's sort of against violence and against war. And, of course, the real irony was that it was an act of suppression about a book and a video that is about suppression. So there were a lot of people protested, and that sort of ended it after a few days.
Well, speaking of the stories that were told about what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I wanted to go to Wilfred Burchett, the first journalist to make it into Hiroshima, which was bombed 3 days before Nagasaki. It was bombed August 6, 1945, an Australian reporter who defied the U.S. military ban, who took a train for 30 hours. The whole area of southern Japan was off limits. He took this train to Hiroshima. In this recording, an excerpt from the documentary of Andrew Phillips called Hiroshima Countdown, Burchett describes what he saw.
I went to a hospital which had survived in the outskirts of the city. These people were all in various states of physical disintegration. They would all die, but they were giving them whatever comfort could be given until they died. And the doctor explained that he didn't know why they were dying. The only symptoms they could isolate from a medical point of view was that of acute vitamin deficiency. So they started giving vitamin injections. And he explained that where they put the needle in, then the flesh started to rot. And then gradually the thing would develop this bleeding, which they couldn't stop, and then the hair falling out. and the hair falling out was more or less the last stage, and a number of the women who were lying there with sort of halos of their black hair, which had already fallen out. I felt staggered, really staggered by what I had seen, and just where I sat down, I found some lump of concrete, I remember, that had not been pulverized. I sat on that with my little Hermes typewriter, and my first words, I remember now, were, "I write this as a warning to the world."
I write this as a warning to the world, Wilfred Burchett wrote, his reporting exposing the horrors of the bombings and particularly talking about, well, he didn't have the words for radiation. He talked about an atomic plague.